There was a moment, and I remember it clearly, when a patient of mine, a 72-year-old retired school teacher named Margaret, sat across from me in my office and said something I never forgot. She looked down at the stack of referral slips in her lap, cardiology, endocrinology, urology, and she quietly said, "I came in because my knee hurt." And then she looked up at me and asked, "How did it come to this?" I didn't have a good answer for her that day, and that bothered me for a long time. Because the honest truth is, the system that was supposed to help Margaret had quietly stopped seeing Margaret. It was seeing a checklist. And I think if you're watching this, you already know exactly what I mean. Maybe you've sat in that same chair. Maybe you've held those same slips of paper. And maybe, like Margaret, you walked out of a doctor's office feeling more frightened and more confused than when you walked in. That is not a failure of your understanding. That is a failure of the system to explain itself. And today, I want to start being honest with you about why that happens. Not to frighten you and not to turn you against your doctor, but because you deserve to understand what's actually going on. Because when you understand it, something shifts. You stop feeling like a passenger, and you start feeling like you're back in charge. Here's the thing about modern medicine that nobody really sits down and explains to you. It was built, largely, around younger bodies. The clinical trials that shaped most of our treatment guidelines, the studies that told doctors what numbers to chase and what thresholds to treat, were conducted primarily on patients in their 40s and 50s, sometimes younger. And those findings were then handed down as universal rules, applied to everyone, including people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, whose bodies work differently, whose priorities are different, whose relationship to risk and benefit is genuinely, measurably different. That's not a conspiracy, that's not negligence necessarily, it's a gap, a structural gap that has never fully been closed. And the result of that gap, the practical daily result that you feel when you sit in a waiting room or read a lab report, is that the advice you receive is often not calibrated to you. It is calibrated to a population that does not include you. Now, layer on top of that the way modern primary care actually operates. The average primary care appointment in this country lasts somewhere between 15 and 18 minutes. In that window, your doctor is expected to review your history, address your concerns, order appropriate tests, manage existing prescriptions, and document everything in an electronic record that was designed more for billing accuracy than for patient communication. There is no time in that model for nuance. There is no time for the conversation that Margaret needed. And so what fills the gap, what replaces nuance, is protocol, standardized protocol. The same protocol, more or less, for everyone. And here's where it starts to affect you in ways that are very concrete and very real. Protocols generate referrals. Referrals generate tests. Tests generate findings. And findings, here's the kicker, findings almost always generate more findings. Because the human body, especially the body of someone who has lived 60, 70, 80 years, is full of what medicine calls incidentalomas. That word sounds technical, so let me translate it immediately. An incidentaloma is something a scan or a test finds by accident, something that wasn't the reason you got the test in the first place. A shadow on an image, a nodule, a slightly enlarged something. Most of the time, these findings are completely benign. They are the natural markings of a life lived in a body. But the moment they appear on a report, they enter a system that is structurally incapable of leaving them alone. Not because your doctor is reckless, but because the system creates liability for inaction. A doctor who investigates an incidental finding and it turns out to be nothing has followed protocol. A doctor who doesn't investigate and something develops has not. So investigation happens almost automatically, and you, the person in the chair, you get swept along in a current you didn't know you'd entered. And nobody stops to ask the question that actually matters most, the question that your body already knows the answer to, even if the chart doesn't, which is, How are you actually feeling? What does your daily life look like? What matters to you? Because here's what I've come to understand after years in this field watching patients go through this. The tests are not designed to answer those questions. They're designed to find abnormalities. And in a body that has lived as long as yours has, they will find them every time. That is not a diagnosis. That is arithmetic. I want to tell you about something that happened that I think about more than almost anything else from my years in practice. I had a patient, a man in his late 70s, I'll call him Arthur, who came to me after a routine scan had revealed a small aneurysm in his abdominal aorta. The finding had been incidental. He'd had the scan for something else entirely, something minor, already resolved, but now there was this, and Arthur had been referred to a vascular surgeon, and the surgeon had been thorough, professional, and appropriate, and had presented Arthur with his options: monitoring or intervention. And Arthur, being Arthur, a quiet, independent man who had run a hardware store for 40 years and prided himself on never making a hasty decision, Arthur came to me and said, "I need you to help me understand what they're not telling me." That phrase, what they're not telling me, I've heard it dozens of times from patients who are not anti-doctor, not irrational, not difficult. They are simply experienced enough to know that every presentation of information involves a choice about what to include and what to leave out. And Arthur was right. Here is what the surgical consultation, through no fault of the surgeon, had not fully conveyed. The aneurysm was small, below the threshold that most current guidelines consider high risk for rupture. Arthur's overall cardiovascular health, given his age, was actually quite good. The procedural risk for a man of his age and profile was not trivial, not catastrophic, but not nothing. And the monitoring approach, watchful waiting, regular imaging, was in fact the choice that a significant body of evidence supported for someone with his presentation. None of this made Arthur's situation simple, but it made it navigable. It gave him the information he needed to make a decision that aligned with his life, his values, his priorities, his definition of quality of life, rather than a decision made by default because he didn't know he had options. He chose monitoring. He lived well for years, and every time I saw him, he would shake my hand and say, "Thank you for treating me like I had a brain." That should not be a remarkable thing to say to a doctor, and yet it is. Here's the honest truth about why this happens, why Arthur had to come back for a second conversation just to get the full picture. It's not because doctors are hiding things from you. It's because the system in which they work has optimized for a very specific outcome: the detection and treatment of disease. That is a noble goal. In an emergency room, in an oncology ward, in an ICU, in those settings, that optimization saves lives every single day, and we should be grateful for it. But in the context of routine care for people who are, and by aging, I mean people who are not acutely ill, who are managing the natural complexity of long lives in aging bodies, that same optimization can quietly, unintentionally work against your interests. Because your interest at this stage of life is not simply the absence of disease. Your interest is the presence of a good life. Those are not always the same thing, and the system, as it is currently structured, does not always know how to serve both at once. There's a concept in geriatric medicine, a field I have enormous respect for, called the treat-to-target model. The idea is that you identify a specific numerical target, a blood pressure, a cholesterol number, a blood sugar level, and you treat until you hit it. It's a clean, measurable, satisfying approach. And for certain conditions, in certain populations, it works beautifully. But for an 80-year-old who is managing 4 or 5 chronic conditions simultaneously, treating aggressively to hit a number for one condition can quietly destabilize another. This is called the problem of competing comorbidities, and it is one of the most under-discussed realities of senior healthcare. The blood pressure medication that gets your numbers where the guideline says they should be might be the reason your legs ache when you try to walk. The statin that is managing your cholesterol according to protocol might be the reason you don't want to leave the house anymore. I'm not telling you to stop any medication. Please hear that clearly. What I am telling you is that the conversation about whether a treatment is still serving your life, your whole life, not just your numbers, is a conversation you are entitled to have. And it is a conversation that the current system, with its 15-minute appointments and its protocol-driven referrals and its reflex toward more rather than less, often does not make space for. That is the gap. And it is a gap that falls hardest on people exactly like you, people who are old enough to have accumulated complexity, people whose bodies have lived long enough to generate the kind of findings that keep the testing machine running, people who were raised to trust authority, to not question the doctor, to assume that more information and more intervention is always better. You were not wrong to trust. You were not naive. You were doing what you were taught to do. But here's what I want you to hear today, and I want you to really sit with it. The most medically sophisticated thing you can do at this stage of your life is to slow down, to ask questions, to understand the difference between a finding and a diagnosis, between a risk and a certainty, between a number on a chart and what is actually happening in your body and your life. That sophistication, that kind of engaged, informed, independent participation in your own care, that is not stubbornness. That is not irresponsibility. That is exactly what the best doctors I know wish more of their patients would do. So where does that leave you? It leaves you with something genuinely valuable, which is context. Because understanding why the system works the way it does, understanding the structural pressures and the historical gaps, and the protocol-driven momentum, that understanding changes the way you sit in a doctor's office. It changes the questions you ask. It changes the way you read a report. It changes the difference between leaving an appointment feeling swept along and leaving one feeling that you are actually part of the conversation. And that shift from passenger to participant is what this whole series is really about. If any of this resonated with you, I'd ask you to share it with someone you care about, a spouse, a friend, a sibling who's been through something similar, because the conversation we're starting here is one that a lot of people in your life need to hear too. And the more of us who understand it, the better we can look out for each other.